So we had a meeting last week in Stillwater, and I learned some new things that I did not know about Task 2 and the vocabulary in Task 2 and how that changes the task itself based on what we talked about in class last week. So Task 2 does include a pre-test, a lesson plan, and a post-assessment. So you will have to teach the lesson that you create with this task. It doesn't have to be a big long lesson, it can be a mini lesson, it can be a center, it can be anything you want, but you do need to have pre and post data for a lesson with 2 focus students that you will be narrowing in on, in addition to the whole class or whole group's data. So let's kind of dig into the first part here. I am in the Task 2 requirements file in the PDF, and you also have a hard copy of it, I believe. I'm looking at the artifacts, and the thing that I misunderstood and that I was confused about is when it says selected assessment, that is actually your post-test. That is your post-assessment after you teach the lesson. So anytime you see the word assessment, that is referring to the assessment you give after you teach the lesson to analyze if your lesson worked or not and where you want to go from there. So you can see the first artifact for text box 211 is your post-assessment, and your artifact for 2.2.2 and for both artifacts are your assessment, your post-assessment from student 1 and student 2. So that is important to understand and different than what we talked about last week. So again, anytime you see the word assessment, that is the post-assessment after you teach the lesson. Anytime it says baseline data, that is referring to your pre-assessment. Baseline data means pre-assessment. So for 211, your artifact is the pre-assessment. And for 213, your artifact is the pre-assessment. Okay, so that is very different than what we talked about last week, and I just want to give you some more information about that. Your assessment, your pre-assessment, and your post-assessment can still be the same thing if you want it to be. It can be informal, it can be formal, it can be 3 questions that you ask during bell work and then come back and ask those 3 questions at the end of the lesson or the next day. It can still be something like a Dibbles test or a STAR test as your baseline data. You just need to make sure that your lesson plan and your post-assessment reflect the same information that's in that baseline data in some way. So, for example, if you are using Dibbles scores and the student is, you want to focus in on, let's say, reading comprehension or nonsense words in a first grade class, you have the baseline data from the Dibbles test on nonsense words, and then you do some kind of activity or a center or a lesson on phonics and nonsense words, and then you give not the Dibbles test again, but just any assessment of those nonsense words, and you can see growth based on those 2 things. So you can still use a pre-made assessment if you want to, but you do not have to. And it doesn't have to be a big, long 50-question assessment. It can be 3 to 5 questions, short and sweet, and get what you need to know for the assessment. Okay, so that is the start of Task 2. Before you do anything else, you need to decide what your post-assessment will be. What is the content that you will be teaching? And it can be whatever you're working on in class right now. You do not have to make anything new. You do not have to create some amazing 5-page lesson, just whatever you're doing in your classroom right now, think about how you could do a pre-baseline data assessment, teach the lesson, and then do a post-assessment.